Good evening. Usually somebody says good evening from the back, and I feel really good. Oh, thank you. And welcome to the final lecture in our three-part series on evil, featuring Dr. David Seljak here of St. Jerome's. We want to thank again Kairos Grand River, formerly Challenge for Change, for their co-sponsorship of this event. If you're enjoying these lectures and have enjoyed this mini-series, your donations and suggestions for other mini-series would be most welcome to us. If you donate $10 or more, there's a tax receipt for you, so thank you for those. I'll point you to the lobby where we have the Social Justice Committee of the University Catholic Community selling fairly traded organic coffee, chocolate, and tea. Also, there's a sign-up sheet for our email list if you'd like to be kept up to date about center events. Also, tonight we have Wordsworth books here, so if you've been taking notes and you've heard some of the titles that Dr. Seljak has mentioned, you'll find some of those available in the lobby tonight. And also, as always in our lobby, you will have noticed tonight the friendly faces of Carol and Ivan in person. And tonight is the last night that Carol is with us, and we would like to take a few moments out of our program this evening just to thank her for all of her work with the center over the last several years. And to do that, I'm going to ask one of our former center directors, and the person who has taken more advantage of Carol's adeptness and skills over the years than any of the rest of us, David Seljak, to come and say a few words for us. And Carol and Ivan, if you're there, will you perhaps come up towards the front? I'm sorry, I know you're going to kill me later. I'm sorry, but come anyway.
Okay, I just want to say that this isn't got anything to do with confronting evil. This is a tribute to a very good friend of mine, Carol Person, and her husband Ivan. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to embarrass Carol for a minute. The first year I was director of the center, I was quite new, quite lost. And Carol came on board that year, and we shared 7 years together at the St. Jerome Center, working very closely. I said when I was talking to my colleagues at the St. Jerome's, I said, at first I really didn't like working with Carol because she was so on top of every project, on every deadline, that I'd have to keep up, and I really resented it. I just thought, she's too efficient for me. I need somebody who's a little more spaced out. And yet I also appreciated that when we had guests here at the St. Jerome Center, whether it was former Prime Minister Joe Clark, or it was Preston Manning, or Roy Romano, or Jean Vanier, or Sister Helen Prejean, and I'd be entertaining them over at the President's Lounge and with invited guests, I came here and I knew that absolutely everything was taken care of, that the place was set up, that there was water for the speaker, that the microphones were working, that people were being welcomed, that the email list was being kept, that absolutely every detail had been taken care of. And I want to express my great gratitude to Carol for her perfection, or her striving for perfection in all of her work. She is a model of commitment and competence and joyful living for us all. So please join me in thanking Carol Person and her husband Ivan, who comes to the St. Jerome Center. He's been coming to St. Jerome Center events every Friday, volunteering his time. They call it their date night. I call it the Get a Life night. But Carol and Ivan together are, just for me, what it's all about. And so I want to thank them both, but especially tonight, my good friend Carol Person. Please join me in thanking her.
Carol has been the patron saint of the center for all the years she has worked here, going above and beyond her job description time and again No doubt many of you know her as the first face that greets you when you get here and one of the last faces that you see as you leave. She's also the voice on the phone, and she's the fingers behind those emails. She is treasured by all at St. Jerome's for her warm hugs, her words of encouragement, her surrogate mothering, and assistance of any and every kind at all times. Carol understands her role at St. Jerome's as a vocation of service, and she has shown herself to be both salt and light, time and again, to all those that have worked with her. Ivan, too, has been a longtime friend and supporter of this center. He is present every week, filling and carrying and hauling and tending to whatever needs to be done. I have never seen him leave this place empty-handed. He's usually carting water coolers or boxes or linens or whatever to get taken home and tended to. Tonight I speak on behalf of the St. Jerome's Lecture Series when I say that we, the former and current directors, I thought Megan would be here, which is why I said former, are profoundly grateful for all the good work that Carol and Ivan have done here over the years, making us look better than we are, handling all the details, and making this a warm and inviting place to be. I know that the decision to leave has been a very difficult one for Carol, and similarly, we find it very difficult to see you go. Carol and Ivan, on behalf of the St. Jerome Center, I would like to thank you for all of your years of service, commitment, collaboration, generosity of spirit, and goodwill, with a small token of our appreciation and a very large portion of our love and appreciation. Finally, I'd like to welcome our guest speaker for the evening. But before that, I just want to clear up one little point that's been brought to my attention. For the last few weeks, I know I have been giving our guest speaker a little bit of a hard time, trying to, get some payback in for those years that I was his student. And I'm worried that maybe some of you think that I'm not actually respectful of my elders, which clearly David is. But I just want to assure all of you and put your minds at ease that I am deeply respectful of my elders. And more importantly, I will go out of my way to give special consideration for those whose faculties are beginning to fail them a little bit. And David will affirm this, that every time he has lost his keys, when I was in his office, I have helped him find them. And other times when I was in his classes and he'd use the same joke over and over and over and over and over again, I'd mention it to him, that you've used that joke at least 8 times this term. So I just try to help him along. But anyway, this is all just to say that, if you're concerned, don't be concerned, because I do indeed respect my elders. And should it ever come to my attention that David, in his elderly state, needs help crossing a busy stretch of road, I will certainly get him at least halfway there. So I just want you to welcome our guest speaker, David Seljak, again tonight. Thanks.
This is the problem with being a professor, is that your graduate students all want you to die so they can have your job. So yes, there's a kind of a love-hate relationship. I love Joanne. She hates me. And yes, I do tell the same jokes over. That's why I really like teaching at third age learning groups, because I can tell the same joke week after week, and they never remember. And then I tell that joke, and then I tell it the next week, and they laugh again. So, anyway, in case you haven't had enough of Carol, it was funny that Joanne quoted exactly the piece of scripture that Carol's years of service have recalled for me. That she is indeed the salt of the earth. Today we are finishing up our discussion of evil, and for those of you who are just catching up, This will be on the exam, by the way. The approach we've been taking is to understand evil from the standpoint of the sociological imagination. In other words, what have the social sciences added to our understanding of evil? And basically, we start from that premise of the social construction of reality, that we live in worlds that are made for us through the interaction of people. Nobody actually controls it, but by living in a particular world, we are shaped by that world. So, in other words, just as nobody has invented the English language, but English developed by people interacting with each other. And when we learn the English language, we think in ways that are different than people who grow up in Chinese or grow up in another language. Then we looked at evil in the modern world. First, we looked at how this revolutionizes the concept of sin, and we moved from simply individual sin, in which there was knowledge, intention, and moral responsibility, to the idea of social sin, in which people participate in systems of evil into which they are socialized, so those systems seem normal and natural to them. In fact, they seem good. And so people who grow up in a patriarchal society think that it's normal, natural, and good that men should exercise power over women. And they see women or others who challenge that order as being disordered and dangerous and evil, in fact. So then we talked about the unique forms of evil in the modern world, and rooting this largely in a study of ideology, that one of the earmarks of the modern world, which was brought into being by the industrial and democratic revolutions that have given us enormous power over the earth, enormous power over large populations, that this is, in one sense, it has given us so much wealth, so much power, but there's a shadow side to this. There's a dark side to this. We talked about the ambiguity of modernity. And the ambiguity, of course, is that the power to create great things also gives us the great destructive power, symbolized most readily by the atomic bomb. So modern society is a revolutionary society. I just was reading for fun Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' The Communist Manifesto again. And, I haven't read it in 30 years. It's not something I do for fun. In it, the analysis of capitalism is actually very, very good. Years before people started talking about globalization, Marx said that even though capitalism is very small, it's a minority movement now, it's going to spread throughout every corner of the world. So back in 1848, he's already predicting globalization. Back in the 1840s, he's already predicting commodification, that capitalism would seep into every part of human life. And so we live in revolutionary times. We live in a perpetual revolution now. This is what modern societies are. And the shape and the direction and the speed of the revolution follows the path laid out by ideology. Ideology is the blueprint that people have for building their society, for changing their society. And so this brought us to our discussion of sin as it is typically conceived of. The traditional concepts of sin having to do with individual sin. Of course, there was that cosmological notion of the angels and the devils battling it out, and the communitarian sin, the sin of nations. Israel sins or Egypt sins, etc., etc. But what is missing in this traditional notion of sin or evil is the sociological dimension. And we discussed, forgot a slide. We discussed the definition of social sin, where it's not the individual that sins, it's the collectivity, it's the society. People who grow up in a slave-owning society, for example, they own slaves, they demean them, they control them, they're violent to them when they try to escape, or they don't work hard enough. They don't think they're doing bad. They have been socialized into that world where that makes sense. So they have no sense of guilt. They are operating out of a false consciousness, And out of that false consciousness, they build institutions that dehumanize others. And it's this dynamic that we're going to break down tonight. In my first presentation, I presented something from Gregory Baum's book, Religion and Alienation, which, by the way, Chuck Arian from Wordsworth Book has at the back of the room there. I have to slip in that he also has copies of Christianity and Ethnicity in Canada and Religion and Ethnicity in Canada, which I co-edited, but only because I get kickbacks on those. Actually, I foolishly signed away all the royalties to Research Center. So anyway, I probably lost fives and ones of dollars. That's what they say about academic books. Would you like your royalties in dimes or nickels, right? Anyway, so Gregory Baum, in his book Religion and Alienation, first published in 1975 and re-released in 2006, talks about the four levels, dimensions of social sin. The first are these institutions that dehumanize people, systems defined by racism, or by sexism, by economic exploitation, apartheid. I mean, this is a whole order, a system. And these systems never hang up in the air by themselves. They have to be culturally legitimated. In other words, if people don't believe in them, they collapse. That's what happened to the former Soviet Union. People stopped believing in Soviet communism. For a few decades, they just went through the motions of believing in Soviet communism. They didn't really believe in it, but they were afraid to change it. And it collapsed very, very suddenly, at least to our eyes. You have those institutions and those structures, right? People who believe in apartheid, live in a society built on apartheid. That seems natural then. It seems like the world really is structured that way. And they enter into that world, and at the final level, they make collective decisions based on that. They decide to create a secret police. They decide to create death squads. They decide to create apartheid laws or separate Bantu lands for populations to live on. They shape their society in a way that takes us back, of course, to level number one. They shape their society in a way in which people build institutions that harm and dehumanize others. And this is basically how I've portrayed this graphically in past lectures. I wish I had a laser pointer, but I don't. On the other hand, Dr. Evil had an enormous laser which he was going to use to destroy the world, so you know that I'm not actually Dr. Evil, contrary to Joanne's claims in the first lecture. Some people ask me as I lecture on this, then if our take on reality comes from our socialization, doesn't this also apply to our conceptualization of evil? In other words, what I see as evil and what someone who uncritically lives in apartheid South Africa sees as evil are two different things. What I see as evil and what this person would see as evil might be the opposite things. I see racial equality as good. They see it as a threat, as evil. So how do we know which evil to choose? I mean, don't we slide into a kind of cultural relativism? Isn't that where the sociological imagination takes us? To a place where we can't judge other cultures. We can only understand them, but we can't say our culture is better than Chinese culture, or our society is healthier than Latin American society. So it brings up the two questions, the question of relativism and the question of absolutism. And of course, when you're talking about good and evil, this is what people fear. People fear the category of evil because it's a black box concept. In other words, when you label something as evil, you don't have to talk about it anymore. You don't have to analyze it anymore. It's simply a problem that has to be dealt with. It's a force or a person that has to be eliminated. And so scholars worry about the use of the word evil. So here we've been talking about it for 2 weeks as if we knew what we were talking about. And now only at the third lecture do I say, oh, sorry, this is a problematic category. This probably could be better organized, let's face it. So, tonight, I want to look at the foundations for judging between good and evil in the modern world. In other words, postmodern philosophers argue that any assertion about good and evil has no real philosophical foundation. You can't really of course they argue that you can't say anything. But that assertions about good and evil and what we should do in society and how we should build our societies are really discourses about power. People who say, this is good, mean I want power and I'm going to exercise it in this direction. Okay? And so they argue that there is no truth ultimately, that there are competing discourses of power. And what we call truth, in quotation marks, is simply the discourse of the most powerful party. The winner, the greatest power of the winner is the ability to define what is real, what is true, right? And so you go back into that. The winners get to define the world. They get to dominate the culture and build the structures that people are socialized into, and so they get to define the world for us. And we've talked about this in the past, in the first lecture, how in a capitalist society we are taught a culture of freedom, choice, the individual is number one. We go out into society and we find people buying and selling, working, trying to make a living, trying to better themselves and only themselves. And we enter into a world in which individualism is very strong, materialism is very powerful, consumerism becomes our dominant guiding value system. So when I do this, I go to an Argentinian philosopher named Enrique Dussel, who was exiled from Argentina, as probably any bright and progressive philosopher should be, or would be back in the time of Pinochet. And he says that evil has to do with defining human beings as other. When we define someone as other, as less than human, then we are able to dominate them. We are able to steal from them. We are able to control them and eventually even kill them. And I talked about this a little bit last lecture, I should say, about how very difficult it is to kill another human being. And that's why when countries go to war with each other, the first thing they have to do is dehumanize the enemy. So when we turn someone who should be like us into an other, it's our culture that convinces us, that assures us that killing them or exploiting them is not bad, but normal, natural, and good. And the example of apartheid South Africa obviously applies here. And so Dussel says, how can we find a philosophical foundation for a real definition of good and evil? And even though he's a very radical thinker, he's a delightful man. He's a very small man, and he lectures very energetically, and he talks about the most terrible things in the world. And while he's talking about how the world is going to end in a conflagration of fire and ecological crisis and disease, he's absolutely the most cheerful man I've ever met. Right? And so he goes, isn't this wonderful? And you see, the dominant powers will clash here, and this will mean megadeaths on the millions. It's very interesting to look at it this way. Okay. But he's a delight. So he starts with the basic questions of theology. He's talking about the very basic, almost catechetical questions. Why did God create human beings? And as we learn in Genesis, we are created in the image and likeness of God. Now, the question is an important one because for the Greeks, they never understood, the Jews and their strange ideas about why God would create human beings. If God is infinite, if God is perfect, if God is complete, God needs nothing. So why would God have a creation? Because anything God creates would be of a second order. Anything God creates would have a beginning and therefore a middle and an end. But God is everlasting. God is eternal. So why would God create something that is less than God? Doesn't make any sense. And the Christian answer was that God craves community. God wants community. God creates because God is love. And with love, you need an other. There's a me, an I, and a thou. There's an other that you love. So God creates us in God's own image and likeness in order to have this I-thou relationship, this recognition of that divine spark, the imago Dei, in each person. And that is just God's being. God is love, therefore God craves community, and God is creator. And to have love, you need freedom. You cannot have love without freedom. If the slave tells the slave owner, I love you, we don't really know what that means. The slave may simply be saying, don't hit me, don't steal from me, right? If the slave owner says to the slave, I love you, the slave owner may be saying, I really like what you do for me. I like the fact that you're picking that and I'm not. You're cleaning that and I'm not. There can be no love except between equals. In a relationship like this, a distorted relationship, power distorts any attempt at community and love. And so Martin Buber, of course, talks about this in his famous book, I and Thou. He talks about the I-thou relationship, the face-to-face meeting of two equals, both created in the image and likeness of God. And those are the two great commandments, right? Remember, Jesus is confronted with the question, what are the two great commandments, right? Or what are what does the law boil down to? And it's love your God, right? And love your neighbor as yourself. And because the neighbor is created in the image and likeness of God, there has to be a love of neighbor as well as a love of God. And frequently it's imagined as this equilateral triangle. The closer you get to if the triangle always has to stay equilateral, no matter whether it grows or it shrinks. The closer we come to God, the closer we must come to our neighbor. The further away we move from our neighbor, even though we're worshiping in the temple every day, the further away we are from God. And this is obviously the theology this is the thinking, of Jesus Christ, right? He's constantly taking to task the religious authorities of his day, the hypocrites of his day, who have no love of neighbor and yet are at the front of the synagogue praying and making noise and blessing. And we also had that quote from Amos that ended last lecture, where Amos has God saying, take away your celebrations, the noise of your solemn assemblies. Get them out of my sight. I will not listen to your songs because you do not do justice. So basically it's condemnation of people who think they can move close to God and yet exploit the widow and orphan, ignore the suffering of their neighbor. And so Dussel argues that evil and evil is essentially, or sin, is the destruction of community. That which God wills, we destroy. And we destroy it when we refuse to see the God in our neighbor. We refuse to see the image and likeness of God in our neighbor. And we treat our neighbor not as a thou, but as an it. And so evil and death, he says, come in basic two forms. Domination and despoilation. Domination seems to us rather obvious, the enslavement and control of others. The ability to control, to stop people from being agents, from being the authors of their own lives, from the ability to stop them from living out their own wills. Despoilation simply means taking away the spoils of their labor. When people work, They labor, they tire, but we don't die because we work to produce something that will nourish us again, clothes and shelter and food. And so we eat and we are replenished, and the next day we work. It seems rather pointless, but apparently we do this all the time. And we decline in energy, but then we eat again, sleep again, and on goes life. And this is how we live our lives and reproduce our lives. And this is a wonderful thing. However, when we work and produce our bread, right, and our food, and someone despoils, someone takes that away, they're killing us in a way. They do not give us the ability to, again, replenish ourselves so that we can work, right? And so enslavement at its extreme takes away what the other needs in order to live their lives and to replenish their lives. And enslavement, of course, is the greatest, the extreme example. Economic exploitation does the same. And the reason that this is evil, according to Dussel, is that it represents the instrumentalization of the other. Excuse me, could someone just raise the brown light switches behind you, because the lights are flickering here. Just a little bit. No, not that one. Yeah, the last one on the end. Sorry. Just a little. Thank you. Okay, that'll do. What happens in a time of exploitation, let's say, is that a person becomes an instrument of my will. So if we started with last week, we talked about the example of people of using child labor to sew soccer balls or shoes or shirts. The child is no longer a thou. The factory owner doesn't care about the child's need for play, the child's need for education, for fresh air, for good food, for family and friends. The employer is looking at the child as a shirt sewing or soccer ball sewing machine. And they're doing it, why? Well, simply to maximize profits, right? If we're in the store, we go back to our systemic analysis. If we're in the store, here's a soccer ball, $19. Here's the same thing for $15. We want to maximize our benefits. We take the $15 soccer ball. And the way that got to be a $15 soccer ball is that instead of paying decent wages, the manufacturer has licensed out the product to a factory in Thailand or China or wherever, where a factory owner, because he wants to maximize his profits, is hiring children to sew the soccer balls. And if the owner isn't sadistic, the owner has no joy in torturing the children. If he could find a machine that would sew soccer balls more quickly than children, the children would be pushed out of the factory and the machines would be moved in. The machines and the children are interchangeable, right? So the children have been reduced to machines, to instruments of the will of the factory owner, of the need of the factory owner. And so the I-thou relationship becomes an I-it relationship, where the child is not a thou but an it. And Martin Luther King Jr. frequently alluded to this, that African Americans, he said, were treated as its and not as equals, not as thous. That this was the sin of the white American population, that they did not see the image and likeness of God in their fellow African Americans. Or in African Americans, their fellow Americans. Dussel calls this a form of idolatry. And idolatry, he says, isn't the worship of false idols. And we're going to talk about another definition of idolatry later on tonight. But idolatry is the big sin in the Hebrew Bible. And the opposite of faithfulness, the opposite of fidelity, is not atheism in the Hebrew Bible. It's idolatry, according to Gustavo Gutierrez. And so it's a very important theme, and we're going to touch on it tonight. Dussel says idolatry is when it comes from the totalization of the self. It comes from seeing oneself as the alpha and the omega, the ground out of which one's decisions should be made. In other words, my needs are the important needs. My wants are the important wants. Dorothy Zola, in her last book on the mysticism of death, cites Luther, who says that the sinful man is the man completely turned in upon himself. And it's essentially that idea that when we take our needs, our wants, our desires to be the real and only basis of action, as we're actually taught to do from the classical liberal theory, the Homo economicus that we talked about before, when we do that, we sin. Because then others become not thous, others become its. And you can do this in many, many ways. When you sexually exploit someone, they are an it. They are an instrument for satisfying your need. They're no longer a thou. You're not respecting them. They are an instrument of your own gratification. But this exploitation, this domination, is not just always an individual decision. It's a system. It's an order, in fact. And we find it in social forms that are outside of the control of any individual. We find it in our institutions. We find it in our economic structures or our political structures. They appear to us not to be strange or evil. They appear to us to be good and normal. They're like, remember we talked about how socialization breeds certain things into our bones. And so we think that it's perfectly normal that if we sit on a bus, I was talking to some students today in the other day in Christina Vanna's class, and I gave the example if you're on a bus and all the seats are empty, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, you're coming home on King Street. Some of you people are far too old to be doing this, but I don't know why you're coming home at 2 o'clock on King Street, but we won't get past this. We won't get into this. And you take a ticket, and it's a contract to sit anywhere on that bus, and you choose an empty seat. And another person comes on, they've got a ticket, that's a contract with the transportation, Grand River Transportation. They can sit anywhere on that bus. And they choose to sit right beside you, right? All of a sudden, what's bred in the bone comes out, the idea that we're supposed to give each other a lot of space, right? It's just part of your system. Well, the evil that Dussel is talking about is just part of our system. It's as natural as choosing a $15 soccer ball instead of a $20 soccer ball, which almost each and every one of us would do. So evil then is an order. It's the systemic rejection of the other. It's the systemic failure to recognize in individuals the imago Dei. When the order of evil is patriarchy, it is the systemic refusal of men to recognize in women the fullness of the imago Dei. When it's racism, it is the inability of whites or of Nazis or of white supremacists of every stripe to see in the other person a full human being. And Dussel argues, following Hegel, that this harms both master and slave, both the man and the woman. And as Martin Luther King Jr. argued, both white American and African American. So what's the answer to evil? For Dussel, of course, goodness in life. That God is the living God, the God of life, and thus that which serves life serves God. And goodness then comes through the restoration of that I-thou relationship. And through no other way. There is no ritual, no sacrifice, no prayer, no song that could be sung that can restore our relationship to God that does not restore our relationship to the neighbor and our relationship to the other. In other words, for the Nazi to be saved, he has to be reconciled to the Jew. For the believer in apartheid to be saved, she has to recognize the image and likeness of God in the black African. So it is always the other that must be embraced. That is why goodness serves justice and why goodness serves life. And so the other, then, Dussel argues, is the most important person in society. The people that we hate, the people that we scorn, the people that we value less than others, those are the important people in society. That is the path to civilization. That is the path to salvation, to redemption. And so we have to look for the other. We have to see the other. We have to embrace the other. Last lecture, I talked about how Martin Luther King Jr. uses that sermon on Lazarus, right? And what was Lazarus' sin? There's no indication in that parable between the rich man and Lazarus that the rich man stole the money or otherwise had gotten the money dishonestly. He simply refused to see the poor. He refused to see Lazarus. Lazarus was other. Lazarus wasn't even human. Lazarus was below his dogs, because the dogs at least got scraps from the table. So in our little model here, where we are born into a culture, we go out into the world and we see that the world is structured in a way that makes that culture seem plausible. And so we enter into this world. The other is the breach in the system. The other explodes that system. Until we embrace the other, that vicious circle of going out into an unjust world, having it justified to us by our culture, and believing that world to be real continues. And that continues, that dialectic, if you'll allow me to use that old term, continues until there is a breach in the system, until something breaks in. And that recognition of the other as human shatters that world. Imagine for the Nazi who understands that a Jew is a person with dignity and rights, a person just like themselves. For the slave owner or the slave ship captain, right, who sees that this isn't just cattle, this isn't just subhuman, this isn't animal matter or dead matter to be shipped across the ocean in crowded quarters. This is a human being, and therefore somebody with a life and dignity and a will and the right to live their lives. They describe it as a conversion experience. And it's the other that leads us to conversion. It's the hated other that converts us, that moves us from one world to another world. And Dussel cites that passage in the Bible, that God makes all things new, right? A new heaven and a new earth is created for us when we encounter the divine. And he also cites Karl Barth's idea that God is totally other. The other is God, because God is totally other. Here's a small play on words. But remember, I cited that passage in Matthew, where you have the division of the sheep and the goats, right? And the people who are sent to hell said, well, Jesus says, when I was hungry, you did not feed me. When I was thirsty, you did not give me to drink. When I was in prison, you did not visit me. And when I was an alien, you did not welcome me. And they say, when did we do this? And he says, when you failed to do this for the least of my brothers and sisters, you failed to do it for me. Right? The other, that alien, the prisoner, the person without food, the person without drink, the person without status, Jesus identifies himself with that person. Jesus does not identify himself with the king, with the rich man, with the ruler, with the powerful person. Jesus clearly identifies himself with the poor. And Gustavo Gutierrez has a beautiful book on a terrible situation, the Spanish impact on the Indies, as they were called, on the Aztec and Inca civilizations. And it's called In Search of the Poor of Jesus Christ. And he said there's this great Bartolomé de las Casas was this great Spanish he came across first as a chaplain. He became a slave owner, and then he was converted by the other. He recognized in his slaves not its, but thous. And he said, these are human beings. I can't enslave them. And so he became an advocate for the freeing of the Indians, whom he saw dying by the millions under Spanish control. And he said something very radical for his day. He lived in the 1500s. He said the Spanish who are saying the right words and doing the right rituals and have the right ideas about who God is and what is good, right? They know Jesus Christ is the Savior. But they are worshiping the God of death in their actions because they kill the Indian in order to get gold. They kill the indigenous people that they find there in order to get gold. The Indians, as he called them, right, even though they had the wrong ideas about Jesus Christ swirling around in their head, they had the wrong rituals, they didn't have the sacred Latin language, they didn't have the right Bible or book, right? They had all of that wrong. And yet, because they were trying to live their lives and reproduce their lives, that the Indians were worshiping the God of life. I mean, what a remarkable insight for someone in the 16th century to say that the Spaniards were idolaters. The Spaniards thought of the situation a little bit differently. They thought they'd finally cleared the Iberian Peninsula of Muslims. As a reward, God had given them sovereignty over these vast lands with their great riches. That was their interpretation of the story. But he flips that on its head and he says, no, you are the idolaters. You are not faithful to God because you cause death. And of course, we know that the death that he was addressing was the greatest demographic collapse in human history. That the death that he was describing over those decades and centuries was far greater than anything we've seen, even Stalin's Gulag system. And so this became this idea that it is one's actions, one's commitments that are important and not strictly just one's ideas, that became the basis of a theology of liberation. And the important concept that letting the other touch us and explode our world was defined as in Catholic circles at least, as the preferential option for the poor. That we had to see the world and not in the way that the winners see the world. I mean, we don't look at ancient Egypt through the eyes of the Pharaoh. In the Exodus story, we look at ancient Egypt through the eyes of the Israelites, the eyes of the losers, the uneducated, the workers, right? That's the model in the Hebrew Bible, and that's the model that Jesus Christ adopts and accepts. But the theology of liberation does not start just with the theory or end with it. It's rooted in praxis. What do we do? Right? Whom do we serve by our actions? Words and thoughts are easy. Trust me, I'm an academic. Right? This is how we live. We live by words and thoughts. It's a great life. It's a lot better than working. But in the end, it's actions that count. Right? Actions are you do this or you do that. You move to Vancouver and become a lawyer, or you move to Toronto and you become a violinist. you can't do both. Actions are final. Actions force us to choose. Thinking we can keep all those options swirling in our head forever. Right? So how do we act? And so that's why Bartolomé de las Casas said, even though the Spaniards have these wonderful thoughts in their head, right? Their actions show them to be servants of the idol of death. And even though the Indians have all these wrong thoughts in their head, their actions show them to be worshippers of the God of life. And this is how, of course, this is Gregory Baum's interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's not original, but I remember it in a talk. And he says, the Samaritans and you have to remember Jesus was Jewish, and for him the Samaritans had the wrong idea. They worshipped on the wrong mountain, had the wrong rituals, the wrong books, the wrong thoughts swirling through their heads. And yet in the parable of the Good Samaritans, right, the priest and the Levite who have the right thoughts in their head, read the right books, know the right mountain, go through the right rituals in the right temple, pass by. So they have right thinking. But it's the Samaritan who's celebrated in that story because he has the right action. And you notice that Jesus never, in that story, says, oh, and by the way, he finally learned where the right mountain was, right, and where the right books are and the right rituals were, and he became a good Jew like me. No. He left righteous and justified, and yet he hadn't changed a single idea. He hadn't learned a thing, but he had done the right thing. He had served life, and that made him righteous. And so it's Jesus who identifies himself with the poor. And in Luke's gospel, he does this from the very beginning of his ministry, where he reads from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah and says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus identifies himself with the poor repeatedly. And it's just wonderful to read the Bible again. I found this, I came to the University of Toronto from a Catholic high school in Toronto, St. Mike's High School, and I came with very traditional notions. And to reread the Bible and to read parts of it for the first time with this perspective, and you look at the thing and you say, this is a subversive document. This is Marxism, right? And that's Kurt Vonnegut in one of his novels has a government official, and his job is simply to write the president a report every once in a while about youth activism in the 60s. And he says, youth today remain committed to peace, love, and helping one another. I trace this to the New Testament, period. Right? Like I said, it's a subversive document. And in the Catholic Church, the preferential option for the poor has become part of our social teaching, which as many people call the Church's best kept secret. And just to show, I'm not making this up, and it's not just me. Here you have John Paul II talking about that our solidarity with the poor must now become globalized. It's not enough to be in solidarity with the poor just in our city, our neighborhood, and community, even though those are important. Our solidarity must become global. Why? Because we have a globalization of the free market system. We have the globalization of the political system based on realpolitik. Both of those systems, he says, are based on the logic of sheer advantage. The powerful become more powerful, the rich become more rich. And he wants to replace that with a global culture of solidarity. And he makes this point about ideology in a very poignant way. And I find a lot of people come up to me after the lecture and complain about this one. Remember, John Paul II grew up in Poland, right? And so he was invaded by the Nazis, liberated by Stalin. That's got to be one of the world's worst cases of luck. The Polish people were terribly tortured by both the Nazis and then the Soviets coming in by Stalin. And he's experienced fascism, he's experienced Nazism, he's lived under Marxism. And so he writes then, we have to take it very seriously when he says that when we work ideologically and we forget about the dignity of the human person, we forget that poor people have that imago Dei, that we're supposed to be in a neighbor, a self, I-thou relationship with them. We're supposed to love our neighbors. That we see the results of this. We see the terrible results of this in these ideological systems. And he says, no less pernicious, though not always as obvious, are the effects of materialistic consumerism. And by that he means us. By that he means the globalization of the free market system in which people define the end of life as the maximization of their worldly pleasures. And that comes from Jeremy Bentham, the great British philosopher. His definition of the rational person was the person who sought to maximize their material benefits. And that is the definition of the person that underlines our economic system. And the reason this is sinful is that the other is treated as totally irrelevant. Right? The other is seen as counting for nothing, to use the words of Marilyn Waring, a famous New Zealand economist and former parliamentarian. That the other is seen as it just doesn't enter the equation, right? We want the $15 soccer ball, not the $20 soccer ball. How the soccer ball comes to us, we don't care. We just want to maximize our benefits. We don't really want to torture children. We simply want to maximize our material benefits. So we take the cheap over the slightly more expensive. So this is his attempt to overcome the idea of relativism, that you can overcome the idea of relativism by rooting the worldview in that original intention of God to create community. That in that original, that phrase that is so cliche and yet, when thought of in these terms, so absolutely poignant, that God is love. Gustavo Gutierrez also, I said, I'll come back to another definition of idolatry. And the idolatry, he argues, has two dimensions. The first is the cognitive dimension that is so often talked about. You have the traditional definition, of course, which is the worship of false gods. And Gutierrez, who argues that it is really the acceptance of something finite as absolute. So we've dealt with relativism, which can be a sin, now that Pope Benedict is fascinated by, consumed by, obsessed by. But he never talks about absolutism as a sin. And I keep using the word absolutization, and I can't find it in any dictionary, but it's a great word. So when we make something that is finite, absolute, that's when we sin. The free market system, I've said before, is an amazing human invention. We've never had so much prosperity. We've never had so much wealth. We've never had so much good health, right, in societies that develop functioning free markets. But it's the belief that the free market system works everywhere, every time, for everyone. When we make that absolute, that's when we have the great potential to do evil. And this is how, according to Gutierrez, we engage in idolatry in its practical dimension. And he defines this by three marks. First, there is the element of trust and submission. We trust the idol and submit ourselves to it. I'm reminded in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was building up the American nuclear arsenal. The Methodist bishops of the United States released a letter in which they called this idolatry, that the government was putting its trust in nuclear weapons to keep us safe, that they were submitting themselves to the logic of realpolitik and MAD, right, mutually assured destruction, MAD, that they had created this system, and now they had submitted themselves to that system. They had forgotten diplomacy. They had forgotten seeing their enemies as human beings with their own needs and wants and desires, and therefore someone you can dialogue with, someone you can negotiate with. They had defined their enemy as other. And to protect themselves against that hated and feared other, they had built this idol and submitted themselves to it. So it is, by his definition, trusting and submitting ourselves to something that is the work of human hands, because only God is absolute. Anything human-made is finite. Anything human-made is flawed. Anything human-made, any system, social system, that is made by human beings will eventually have victims. And yet we enter into the world and play through the world as if it didn't have flaws. I mean, we know in some abstract intellectual sense that it does. But on the practical level, we play the game as if the coffee we drink doesn't create poverty, it isn't picked by people who are earning $1.25 US a day, which is the absolute bottom kind of rate of subsistence living around the world. As if the clothes we wear weren't made in sweatshops or weren't made by people who are earning very little money, et cetera, et cetera. We live as if we are not living in sin. And the final mark of idolatry, of all idols, is the demand for human victims. So if we believe that the free market system works everywhere for everyone at all times, we don't care that millions of people are dying because they don't have access to food, because we say if we interfere with the market system and feed those people, we will break the system and everyone will suffer. And so we're willing to tolerate those deaths. The UN World Development Project estimates to be 45,000 people a day. We're willing to tolerate the deaths of 30,000 children a day. And for Gutierrez, this is a form of idolatry. These 30,000 children a day, or 45,000 people a day, are the human sacrifices that we feed to our idol. Now, I don't want to pick on the free market system. For Stalin, the idolatry was the revolution. The revolution was important. If the revolution meant, because the revolution was, the revolution saved some people, but now he thought it could save everyone everywhere at all times. And if the revolution required the starvation of 5 million Ukrainians in the 1920s, well, that's tough, but that's what the revolution requires. The revolution is good. Stalin felt that the revolution was not the work of human hands. It was the work of history. It was he is a believer in this kind of scientific materialism, that this was the work of nature and of history. And this was the good, and anyone who opposed the revolution must be evil. So he made the revolution absolute and sacrificed human lives to it. So then, according to this understanding of Gutierrez, and absolutization is not his term, but mine, evil comes from the absolutization of anything that is finite, anything made by human hands. And the reason for this is that we have to be critical of all institutions. We have to be critical of our own society. We have to be critical of ourselves, always. Because everything we do, every system that we set up, whether it be the free market, whether it be socialism, whether it be communism, whether it be something in between, is always flawed. It's always distorted because we only have part of the knowledge. We don't have the whole of the truth. We only have part of the truth. And it's always distorted by self-interest. Right? Al Gore has that famous, in his film, if you'll call it that, An Inconvenient Truth, he cites Mark Twain, who says that it's very difficult to get a man to see something if his livelihood depends on him not seeing it. Right? So self-interest always kind of twists our perception. And I think it's very difficult for people to take the ecological crisis, for example, very seriously, because there is this suspicion, this intuition, that if they took it seriously, their material self-interest would be impacted rather dramatically. So, in a very quick summary then, all of our ideologies and the systems that grow out of them are partial, distorted by self-interest, and therefore potentially dangerous if they are applied uncritically and universally. In other words, if they're absolutized, if they are made to be or thought to be absolute rather than limited. And since they are partial, since they are limited, they always will create victims. Every system creates its own victims. And therefore, our loyalty must not be to any system, whether capitalism, socialism, Obamaism. Our loyalty cannot be to any party, any state, any revolution. Our loyalty has to be to the victim. And that's what the preferential option for the poor is. What we must do is constantly seek out the victim in society. The person that we ignore, and it's very difficult to look at the people you ignore. I mean, you first have to say, what in this picture am I not seeing? Right? It's like the video of the basketball teams that we watched last week, right? We're not trained to see the victim. In fact, we're trained to see the winners. Right? E-Talk Daily and these news shows and entertainment shows, we're trained to see winners. We're not trained to see the people who are the victims of our society. Newspapers don't report on people who go bankrupt or people who are kicked out of their homes, unless there are millions and millions of them. They tend to report more the people who are doing well. So, in closing, then, the commitment must always be to life, according to Gutierrez, because in the Hebrew Bible, God is identified with life. There really is good and evil. There really is life and death. And too often we think about right and wrong interpretations, smart and stupid, them and us. And this perspective really asks us to not completely get rid of those distinctions, but to add to our thinking self-criticism about our actions, self-criticisms about what we do in the world and how we do it, and who are the victims, because it is those people to whom we owe our allegiance, because those people are God's representatives on earth. It's those people who are the poor, who are Christ's presence on earth. Because when we serve life, I often use my own conception of God, evolves over time. And I often tell people my definition of God now is life with a capital L. That life happens, and let's face it, it comes and goes. But life with a capital L is my conception of God now. Because there really is good and evil. There really are systems and institutions and decisions that serve death and that serve life. And as Christians, as people of all faith, and as people of goodwill without faith, we're called to serve life. Thank you.
Again, we welcome your questions, so if you can formulate them concisely to give opportunity to many who would like to speak, that would be great. We have microphones on either side of the room. And while you're formulating your questions, I just want to take a quick opportunity to defend myself a little for your remarks about me hating him, and that's simply not true. It's more of a sibling rivalry kind of model where, the affection is tempered by mutual abuse. And you may have noticed, I don't know, some of you may have figured it out, but I'm a youngest child. Did you get that? I learned as a young person to strike first and strike harder. They will crush you. So just to explain things. But we have a question. I'll start here, please.
Thank you.
So this came up in the first lecture, but I'm still not very clear on the response to the kind of evil that says, well, if I don't do it, then somebody else will, and especially, because you're saying that societal evil is bigger than any one person can do, then how you can respond to that effectively. Like I might say, well, I'm not going to participate in this evil, but somebody else will. And so how can you convince somebody else of that, especially if that person doesn't have your values or, does not, or is an atheist or something like that?
Thank you. Yes. Two very good questions, because I lecture, when I talk about this, I tend to deal in abstractions. That's my job. And I'm not an organizer, and I'm not very practical. What my students in RS 100L very often don't pick up until much later is that I don't teach, I preach. And this course is really an extended sermon. And what I hope to do is, I think the educational system turns them into professionals, turns them into self-interested individualists. They hand in a paper, they get a grade. Later on, they hand in work, they get a paycheck, right? And I try to throw sand into the works. And so that when they later on are being processed by the great machine that is our society, the sand gums up the work. And, this makes it painful for them. But Catholics are always willing to scar their children for their own good, right? And I was scarred, so, why not? But I really hope to make students unassimilable. And I always have a dream of preparing a workshop on teaching called Refusing to Teach the Leaders of Tomorrow, right? Because tomorrow might be dreadful, and I don't want students to participate in that catastrophe. I want them to resist that catastrophe. And I was talking to Derek Suderman, very talented Hebrew scholar of the Hebrew Bible here at Conrad Grebel. And we were talking about creating a subculture of resistance. And I think this is what's called for today, is that the world is becoming more and more dangerous. We're more rapidly approaching a very dangerous time. It seems impossible that we can't somehow steer off course. And so I think very often what I would like to do is to teach people, students, to resist this. And then I think I talked about this last lecture. What can an individual do? And in my opinion, very, very little. If you want to solve this on your own, you will be crushed. You won't last. It's it's just too much, and your efforts are too puny. You have to find other people who think like you. You have to join groups. You have to sacrifice evenings, perhaps weekends. But the good side of it is you make friends. And this group, which is Kairos Grand River now, I used to work with them when it was called Challenge for Change. And I became very good friends with some of the people there, and I cherish these friendships very much. So you will not solve this by yourself. Find a group, find some friends, and you will find that this is really a cure for loneliness, isolation, alienation. If I were a therapist, I would be prescribing group therapy, understood as I've just described it to my patients. The other thing is how to deal with the if I don't do it, someone else will problem, which is a problem because if I don't reduce the price of my soccer balls to get them to the market at $15, somebody else will use child labor, right? This is the problem that you're talking about. And that is why the fantasy of a global economy run without government regulation is so very, very dangerous. Because if we take away that moderating influence of regulation, then indeed there is no way to stop it. There will always be someone who's willing to push the bar a little lower. And so people call this the race to the bottom. And so, for example, with the ecological crisis, a lot of what's happened in the last 10, 15 years with the ecological crisis has come from the dismantling of the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States and similar agencies around the world. So if I don't externalize my costs by polluting, another company will, and they'll bring their paper or plastic to the market at a lower price than me. So without regulation, you're basically encouraging people to pollute. In fact, you are forcing people to pollute, to choose between polluting or simply going bankrupt. So if someone can figure a way to avoid the race to the bottom in terms of labor or the race to the bottom in terms of environmental standards without government regulation, I'm all ears. I'll hand you the Nobel Prize myself. So,
Professor Seljak, nice suit.
Thank you. I was hoping somebody would notice it. I got it on Boxing Day.
He told my class to make sure to check it out when he was there, so we're checking it out. I know you care about the environmental crisis. Lots of references to that. My question has to do with asking you, how easily do you think this analysis you've given us tonight can be applied to the ecological crisis? And if you think it can, how? In other words, for example, evil occurs when we define human beings as other and all the consequences that follow from that. So can we think about the ecological crisis as evil occurring when we regard the natural world as other? Can we take this analysis in that direction? Or do we have to say the ecological crisis is a consequence or one of the consequences, one of the things that happen as a result of the analysis of human problems?
Yes, thank you, Chris. I was worried you were going to ask me a real theological question, and Chris is a theologian, and I'm an amateur at it. Yes, I do apply this to the ecological crisis, especially when I talk about Thich Nhat Hanh in the course. And, of course, this is something that is new and evolving in Catholic thought, and Chris does her research in the area, so I'm not telling her anything new. But even John Paul II was influenced by this idea and suggested that we have to come up with a new anthropology because our current anthropology in Catholic thinking and in theology of liberation, except for some other thinkers that Chris could name, Sally McFaig, for example, and Rosemary Radford Ruether is another example. Our current thinking is the human being as if they're this billiard ball outside of nature. But as we discussed last lecture, human beings come from nature, right? I mean, you were born, you weighed less than a gram. Now you weigh about 50 kilograms to 100 kilograms. All that stuff came from out there, right? There's a Buddhist saying, you say, you are what you eat. And John Robbins, this is not very polite, but I'll come up with a polite version. No, it's you are what you don't defecate. Right? You can use the short word in your brain. And that's true, right? Whatever you eat, all this stuff, and whatever doesn't come out is you. That's the definition of you, right? what I eat minus the stuff I leave behind, that's it. That's all you. So can we separate the human beings from nature? And traditional Christian theology certainly has. And John Paul II talks about this new anthropology where human beings are not seen as separate from nature. He left it hanging there, and Benedict XVI hasn't pursued it, to be sure, which is unfortunate. But there are many gifted theologians working in many different traditions who are working on this problem of creating a new anthropology. That being said, I always insist that to abstract the ecological crisis from the social justice question is not right. Because very often the argument is that our system today is too anthropocentric, centered on anthropos instead of on nature and sentient beings. And remember I showed you that champagne glass graph on world income, right? I mean, imagine, and imagine that glass should be much broader. If we just took the richest people in the world, the glass should be much broader at the top, much thinner at the bottom. And when I look at that champagne glass graph, I say, this system isn't anthropocentric. Look at all those anthropos, 60% of the human beings are left out of this system. It's not centered on them. This system is centered on wealth and power. That's what the system is centered on. Because people truly believe that the more wealth and power they have, the better things are. And so it's, I often think that a movement from our system to an anthropocentric system would be a great leap forward, right? I mean, Gandhi was asked what he thought of Western civilization, and he said, I think it would be a good idea. And I would say the same of an anthropocentric world. I think it would be a very good idea. It would be 2 steps forward from where we are now. But that being said, I am very sensitive to and appreciative of these other critiques that come from people interested in the ecological crisis. And now you do see even some of the original liberation theologians going back to their work and admitting that this is a serious flaw in it. So
I don't mean to be disrespectful to people who are here. I am not a religious person. But what you said today, there was God and He created the world. Why He created the world? Well, perhaps He was lonely. He created the world, which means when you create something, you destroy something. And I really would like to know what is it that He had destroyed by creating what we have today. He was powerful. So to fulfill His need, He created victims, human race, to fulfill His needs. And what it seems to me, this is how the world is running. There are always big institutions, big power, like God had big power. He creates human race. Now, these big institutions, they are very powerful. And what do? Create victims.
Mm-hmm. The theological question, I'm not qualified. Like I said, I'm not a theologian. I do read theologians, but I would only say that the act of creation is an act of God's self-limitation. For us to be autonomous, for us to be free, God has to withhold or withdraw from a certain sphere God's power to direct and control. So, if God wanted, 6 billion robots going to church on Sunday in their nice suits, thank you, Christina, God could have done that. God could have created those robots, right? And it's like that Star Trek episode where in the first series of Star Trek, I'm giving away my age, thank you, Joanne, where, they come to a planet and Kirk, there's this man here who's written all of Bach's music and all of Shakespeare's work. He turns out to be an alien traveling the universe creating art. And he's retired to this planet and he has created a beautiful alien robot. And of course, all aliens in the Star Trek series are, scantily clad, beautiful models. And it's just that's how the universe worked out. And but the man isn't happy. And why is he not happy? Because he wants the robot to love him. And she can't, she says, I love you, but she's programmed to say, I love you. Right? And God could have done that with us. We could all be robots programmed to say, yes, Hosanna, 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 and doing all the right things and never sleeping with the wrong people, never being angry with our neighbor, etc., etc. I sometimes do that all in one day. But God doesn't. God allows freedom, right? Which means that God withdraws a certain degree of power and control over us in order that we may be free. And of course, in the Star Trek episode, Captain James T. Kirk falls in love with the alien life form because apparently it's a rule that every female alien life form is absolutely irresistibly drawn to William Shatner. And with always at their own peril. He should come with a, please do not fall in love with me, you will die, a warning signal. Anyway, so, and then she falls in love and becomes, quote unquote, a sentient being. And the point is then that the person must be free to choose, or there is no love. And that's what God does when God creates. And moving from there, you can argue that this is where evil comes. When God withdraws total power and control, people are free to choose life or to choose death. And this is where human evil comes from.
My question is, you mentioned that we have to be loyal or show our loyalty to the victim, but aren't we all victims? Like even John Paul was a victim, and I can understand, in a way, showing our loyalty to John Paul, but is he any more or less a victim than, say, Catholic kids are, who were scarred by their Catholic parents, who were scarred by their Catholic parents, and are we not scarring our Catholic kids? So who's the victim? And then are we not just supposed to be loyal to humanity? But if we're loyal to humanity, are we still loyal to the Creator or God?
Right. Very good. The victim is in every relationship. I mean, this is a very simplistic kind of analysis I've done up here because that's what I specialize in. I'm very shallow. And style over substance. It's a nice suit, isn't it? The victim, this is very simplistic kind of analysis in a one-night lecture. There are multiple dimensions of victimhood, right? In every relationship there can be many dimensions of victimhood back and forth. Anyone who's in a relationship knows this. And yet, when we're looking at this from a sociological imagination, from the social perspective, and we see that in encounters there is a powerful and a weak person, right? Our loyalty has to be with the weak person. It's, if you want to say that the Pharaoh was a victim and the Israelites victimized other people, go ahead, but, they were slaves and the Pharaoh wasn't. There's a real difference there. If you want to say that white Americans were victims as well as black Americans, well, in a sense that might be true. But on the other hand, there were people with access to wealth, power, education, and prestige, and there are people who are denied access to wealth, power, education, and prestige. And those are the people that we should be looking at. So it's not a psychological definition of victimhood, though that is important, but this analysis doesn't really deal with it quite in those terms. So.
If I could I was very active in the Catholic Church in the 70s, And I would like to get your opinion on, for example, the preferential option for the poor came from the meeting with the South American bishops. And you also quoted many things from John Paul. So I've got two questions. Liberation theology was basically put down, if I could use that word, by John Paul II, and it certainly hasn't been raised by Benedict XVI in any shape or form. What you might count for the reason for that. And at the same time, in a sort of double thing, John Paul wrote all this wonderful stuff, which, if I could be so critical, conservative Catholics studiously ignore and exaggerate the other stuff. So those two things have always rather puzzled me as to what happened to liberation theology in official circles.
Yes. I mean, there was a shift in the 80s. I mean, it was a structural shift and a global shift of culture away from the excitement of the 1960s and early 70s, which were a period of enormous change. I mean, we always talk about the 60s and we think of hippies and sex, rock and roll, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And while those were the fun part of the 60s, I mean, the 60s was also that period of decolonization, right? Where, I mean, this was what was so new and exciting. It was the civil rights movement. It was the feminist movements that haven't dissipated. I mean, feminism is now a global phenomenon, and there are groups all around the world working towards liberation of women. And so that was an explosive moment. In the 1980s, there was a global kind of shift, retrenchment, represented, for example, by the election of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was one element. So there was the cultural conservatism that accompanied that shift. There was also the fact that the Catholic Church is an institution itself, and institutions have their mission, which they had adopted this liberation theology, at least in important documents by Paul VI as well as John Paul II. But it's an institution, and institutions have interests, and it's not in the interests of a large institution to stand up to power, to stand up to wealth. It's very difficult to ask for large donations from somebody you're saying, well, you know, you exploit workers and we're really going to help the unions organize in your neighborhood. We're going to help unionize your workers so that you give them a fair share. And by the way, the church roof is falling and can we have a donation, right? That's a tough sell. But, I mean, on a more serious front, politically around the world, in many of these countries, right, it's very difficult for people to remain in opposition. And that's why building a kind of subculture of resistance is a spiritual exercise, right? Gandhi knew that. Martin Luther King knew that. Thich Nhat Hanh knows that, right? That it is a spiritual exercise. It's very, very difficult. And it's a lifelong project to remain in opposition. John Paul II, I mean, for him, liberation theology had echoes of Marxism. And so in one sense, he's a great contradiction in terms. I mean, for him, you know, on one hand, you read this stuff. You know, what I often do is I put up a quote of John Paul II when he visited Canada, right? And he said that the needs of the poor have priority over the wants of the rich. The rights of workers have a priority over the rights of capital. The environment has priority over those industries that would pollute it. But I don't put his name on it. And I sometimes put Karl Marx's name on it. And the students all fall for it until the next slide where I show them that, you know, John Paul II was a bit of a radical too. But he's a contradictory figure. Benedict, unfortunately, isn't as complex a figure on this particular issue.
I just wanted to tell you that as a mother and grandmother, I've been quite disturbed by the changing in lifestyles, and it seems to me that God has been replaced by ourselves, by the person. And I just want to thank you for making me feel better tonight, there's hope, I think. And especially to see a crowd of young people and hear somebody like you, I really feel privileged. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Very sweet of you. I only wish my children were here to be mortified by your lovely words. I once gave a talk to a group up in Collingwood, and after the talk, my daughter was standing beside me, and this elderly lady came up and said, "Young woman, you're lucky to have this man as your father. He's smart, he's funny, and, well, I'm going to say it, he's good looking." And my daughter just shriveled up and died. Yes, this is the thing about the human person. On one hand, we have, I loved Zolle's use of that piece of Luther, right? That the sinner is the man turned completely in upon himself, where his needs, his wants, this is what I'm going to act on, no regard for the other, right? And so in one sense, the human person is the problem, right? When the person becomes singularly fixated on the self and becomes selfish. On the other hand, though, the human person, recognition of the dignity of the human person is the answer. But not recognition only of my dignity, but understanding that we are all created in the image and likeness of God. Right? That was Martin Luther King Jr.'s big strategy. That was his theology. That was his worldview, not just his strategy. That whites and blacks were equal. Why? Not because there was some kind of secular political philosophy behind his thinking, because we were all children of God. We were all children of God, created in the image and likeness of God, and therefore our destiny was to interact as I and thou, not I and it.
Two quick questions. In any of the religions you've talked about, or outside of them, to try and associate with the victim, can you help me with the numbers, I guess? I saw a Holocaust survivor presentation. He said 6 million people. He said, just try and visualize that. How many sky domes is that? I doubt I could watch one mother or family lose a child. Mm-hmm. To see people who see violence on a mass scale, probably the most common is a soldier, hundreds or thousands, tens of thousands. That's beyond the visual. Even a soldier doesn't see that much, and they get post-traumatic stress syndrome. Mm-hmm. So how to even, my mind can't process 30,000 children dying and the pain and so how to then relate back to those victims? Of course, to say it's a terrible thing I can do, to think it's a terrible thing I can do, but to really understand it is probably beyond my ability.
Yes.
The second question is, and I might be remembering wrong, but I thought we got to find out who was in the gorilla suit.
Who's in that?
Okay, anyway. So the first one's the main question.
That was the other new suit I bought for Christmas. Stalin's famous saying, the death of one man is a tragedy and the death of a million is a statistic, right? And that's the other thing I worry about when I lecture, because, I talk about the Holocaust and world hunger and people dying by the millions. And it's sometimes the statistics are overwhelming. We don't feel that these are individual people dying. And when I offset this in the course, the books that I use are focused on the individuals. And I use Helen Prejean's book, Dead Man Walking, where you look at the death of one individual, well, two individuals, in fact, death row inmates, death row inmates are totally defined as other, right? They're mad dogs. They should be put down. They're inhuman killers. They're totally outside of the circle of humanity, and we're going to lock them down and kill them, right? That's how she uses it in this book. But for her, she gets sucked into. It's a wonderful book. The movie's great. It won an Academy Award for Susan Sarandon, but the book is worth reading too. And she gets sucked into this kind of ministry to a young man on death row. They hadn't killed anyone in Louisiana for 20 years. She thought that this was just writing letters back and forth, and she gets sucked into this. And she learns to look at this person as a human being. And there's that fantastic moment in the film, and in the book it's described as well, where when he's being executed, she says to him, I will be the face of Jesus Christ to you, right? We will make that I-thou connection, where I will recognize you as a human being and you recognize through my love the love of Jesus Christ. And of course, it's the highlight of the movie as well as the book. The other book I use is Jonathan Kozel's book, Amazing Grace, The Lives of Children and the Something of a Nation. I'll come up to it. But Amazing Grace, just look it up, by Jonathan Kozel, Kozol. And in it he talks about the children living in the poorest congressional district in the United States of America in the South Bronx of New York. And there, Kozel's gift, he's a very gifted writer, it's an easy read, is to go down to the micro level. And I love this because I'm up here in the stratosphere, right, statistically, and, themes and, modernity moving this way and that way. And he gets the fine grain. And he shows the effect of certain systems on the lives of children. And the lives of children and the conscience of a nation. And he says that Americans have abandoned these people. And it's the interaction of two ideologies, racism and neoconservatism or neoliberalism, right? Where we no longer care for these people. If they're poor, it's their fault. They have to work themselves out of poverty. And largely we don't care about them anyway because they're not like us, right? Which is to say white. And so these two ideologies combine so that people simply ignore the children. They don't see them. And he interviews the children. This is his incredible gift, to talk to these children. And you understand that these children are not, when you think of children growing up in unbelievable, terrible ghetto conditions, unsafe housing, poor food, drug dealers on the street as they go to school, prostitutes on the street every night. And you think, well, geez, what kind of human beings live there? And you find out that actually very nice human beings live there. The children are very aware of what's going on around them. And they talk about that feeling of nobodiness, of being shut out, shunted off into these ghettos so that people don't have to look at them, don't have to think about them. And one little girl says it's like that stuff you put up in the garage. You just put it up in the attic of the garage and you never think about it again. And so these victims are human beings who think, live, laugh, and suffer just like the rest of us. And it's easier sometimes to think about them as statistics. And as much as I like to think that it's my wonderful lecturing that pours sands on the gears, I think it's really these wonderful authors that I'm lucky enough to exploit in my courses that help people. So those are two books that I can recommend to you to kind of bring this abstract stuff down to a human level. Because that's what it's about eventually. It's about that human-to-human contact.
It's a gorilla suit.
It's a gorilla suit. Yeah, no. I actually don't do gorilla suits or gorilla suit humor, so I can't help you there. So. Sorry, I just want to say one last thing in passing. People have asked, what can you do, what can I do? I've listed a number of websites here, so you can download these slides off the St. Jerome's website, center website. The first one is kairoscanada.org, which Kairos Grand River is one of the local chapters of. The second one is Buddhist Peace Network. Tikkun.org is a Jewish site run by Rabbi Michael Lerner. If you go to tikkun.com and you want to just see what my basic general theological orientation is, you go there. Okay, so he's Jewish, but he's a very nice guy. And the National Religious Partnership on the Environment is another one. Christina knows this one, of course, and she's a participant in the last one, which is the Canadian Forum on Religion and Ecology. And so these are sites that you can go to, you can get involved in, and if I inspire you to become involved in Kairos Grand River, I'd be very pleased about that. And just before I go, Chuck has given me $10 to mention that Chuck Arian of Wordsworth Book is sitting at the back there. No, he didn't really give me any money. I like the independent bookstore in downtown Waterloo. He has some wonderful books there, including Gregory Baum's Religion and Alienation and a variety of other books based on the themes of this course. And somebody asked me where they could find Thich Nhat Hanh's Pieces Every Step, the book I talked about last week, and I did notice it on Chuck's table. So my last little plug for Chuck. So thank you very much and good night.
I just want to thank you all for making this lecture series a very successful one. You filled the hall every night that we've been here, despite my attempts to get you to see this man clearly. It's clear that you like him, and I thank you for that. Thank you for your support of these lectures. I'm always reminded of Mother Teresa when people ask the questions of what can we do. I'm always reminded of Mother Teresa, who was repeatedly asked, what can we do? How can we help? And her answer was always a very simple one. She would always start with a very basic element of smile at people. That's what she would tell people. She would say, smile at people, see people and smile at them. And she would say, and start at home. Very simple things. You talked about the systemic issues and the big picture issues, but we can start small, and those are good things too. But I want to just thank you again, thank our sponsors, Kairos Grand River, for their support, and also remind you of the book table, and remind you to mark your calendars for March 6th, when Carolyn Whitney Brown will be here speaking about the life and contributions of Jean Vanier in his 80th year. We hope to see you again then. And in the meantime, peace to you.